44 days from now, a column of dragons will descend through the cloud line above the Athervan shelf and find Marin Solvik cross-legged on a flat boulder, grinding basalt into powder with a hand mortar she made from a cracked spectrometer housing. The lead dragon, obsidian black, iridescent green at the jaw, will lower its enormous head to within a meter of her face, and Marin will not flinch. She will gesture toward the roost tower ruins behind her, where a silver shape is breathing. That is how this ends, but it starts with a transfer order. The document arrived on Marin's terminal at the Ganeth Valley Processing Station on a Tuesday, between her morning calibration run and her first field transect. Reassignment effective immediately. Athervan Highland Shelf, Survey Post 16, Solo Sediment Analysis. No rotation date listed. No replacement named for her lowland post. No explanation appended, which was itself the explanation. She read it twice. Then she read the signature line Davin Harsk, Regional Compliance, Colonial Compact Authority, and understood exactly what kind of reassignment this was. 3 weeks earlier, Marin had filed her quarterly sediment report for the Ganeth Valley River System, the same report she had filed 11 times before in her 4 years at the station. The work was unglamorous. Core samples from the riverbed substrate, spectral analysis of mineral content, trend comparisons against the previous quarter. She was good at it in the way that people who like dirt are good at dirt, methodical, patient, genuinely interested in what the layers said. But this quarter, the calciumite concentrations in the downstream nestbed strata had crossed a threshold she could not smooth over. Not a subtle shift. A clear, accelerating trend line showing that processing discharge from 3 compact facilities upstream was calcifying the calciumite egg substrate in active Varanhi nesting grounds. The substrate was hardening. Eggs laid in hardened substrate did not incubate properly. The biology was straightforward. The chemistry was worse. She had flagged it honestly, included the trend lines and her methodology, and forwarded copies to the Compact's Environmental Review Office and to the Varanhi Territorial Liaison. Standard procedure. The same distribution list she had used for 11 previous reports, none of which had contained numbers this bad. Davin Harsk had called her within the hour. His voice carried the particular calm of a man who had practiced being calm in situations where calm was a weapon. "Withdraw the copies," he said. "Refile with adjusted parameters. The methodology has margin of error bands that accommodate a more conservative reading." "The parameters aren't adjustable," Marin told him. "They're measurements. I measure what the rock says." "The rock said this." "The rock said whatever you calibrated it to say, Dr. Solvik. Recalibrate." She had declined, politely in writing with a CC to her department head. Harsk had not responded directly. 3 weeks later, the transfer order appeared. Now she was going to the shelf. Survey Post 16 turned out to be a pressurized hut bolted to a basalt slab at 2,000 meters, surrounded by wind-scoured rock and alpine scrub so sparse it barely qualified as vegetation. The highland shelf was a volcanic remnant, fractured dark gray basalt in slabs and columns, cut by seasonal meltwater channels that were dry this time of year, patched with lichen that had taken centuries to colonize 2 centimeters of stone. The Compact had mapped it as geologically inert and biologically negligible. No processing operations, no extraction value, no reason for anyone to be there except as punishment. The hut itself was functional in the way that punitive postings are always functional, just enough to prevent a formal grievance. Heating unit, water recycler, a fold-down cot with a mattress that had been compressed to cardboard by previous occupants who had presumably also annoyed someone in compliance. The window faced north, toward nothing. Marin set up her equipment on the first day. Portable spectrometer, core sampler, geological hammer, field terminal with a satellite uplink that worked for about 4 hours each afternoon when the relay drone passed overhead. She unpacked her personal kit, a change of clothes, a battered copy of Tethren's Introduction to Varandhi Territorial Biology that she had bought at a station market 3 years ago, because it had nice diagrams, and a field canteen with a heating element that could bring water to a slow boil. On the second day, she walked the shelf's perimeter. 4 hours of hiking across fractured basalt, climbing over collapsed columns, navigating dry meltwater channels cut into the rock like old scars. The geology was more interesting than the compact's inert classification suggested. The basalt was layered in ways that told a story: volcanic flows separated by thin bands of calcium-andite deposits that suggested seasonal mineral accumulation over centuries, possibly millennia. Ancient thermal venting had left trace mineral signatures that would have been worth a paper in the compact's geological journal, if anyone at the journal were currently inclined to publish Maren Solvik. She cataloged what she found because cataloging was what she did. 16 distinct basalt strata visible in a single cliff face. Calcium-andite banding consistent with periodic hydrothermal activity. Sulfur compound residue in sheltered alcoves. An unusual concentration of calcium-magnesium silicate in the lower strata. On the third day, she found the roost tower. It was 300 meters north of her hut, partially collapsed, built from stacked basalt columns arranged in a spiral pattern that could not have been natural. The engineering was precise, each column fitted against its neighbors with tolerances that suggested either extraordinary manual skill or a species that could heat-shape stone. The base stones were carved with angular glyphs that Maren recognized from Tethren's appendix on Varandhi clan markings. Weathered almost smooth. Old enough that the style predated anything in her reference text by what Tethren estimated would be several hundred years. The tower's interior was open to the sky where the upper courses had fallen. Rubble lay in a rough cone on the floor, basalt columns shattered into segments, some still bearing partial glyphs. But the foundation was intact. A circular chamber maybe 8 meters across, with the walls still standing to twice Maren's height. The air inside was different, warmer by several degrees. It carried a faint mineral smell, sulfuric and old, like rock that had been exhaled on for a very long time. She took samples of the foundation stone and the interior air. The sulfur signature was consistent with long-term biological respiration by a large, metabolically active organism. The kind of signature you would expect to find in a space where something very large had been breathing for years. She found the dragon on day 4. Maren came to the tower at dawn to take core samples from the foundation stones, squinting against the early light as she ducked through the gap in the collapsed wall. She took 2 steps inside and stopped. Something enormous was lying against the far curve of the chamber. A dragon. Silver-scaled, the color of old pewter where the light touched the upper surfaces, darkened to charcoal at the joints and in the deep creases between the scale rows. Its body was the size of a freight hauler, maybe 12 meters from the angular snout to the tip of its curled tail, with a shoulder height that would have put its back level with the roof of Maren's hut. The right wing was extended at an awkward angle against the wall, the membrane torn in 3 places with scar tissue calcified white along the tiers like old mortar in cracked masonry. The left wing was folded but visibly stiff, the joint swollen. The legs were tucked beneath the body, and the claws, each one the length of Maren's forearm, curved and ridged like geological formations, were retracted into their sheaths. The head was enormous and angular, armored with layered scales that had gone from what must have been bright silver to a dull iron gray. The nostrils, each as wide as Maren's fist, flared with slow, labored breathing that produced a thin, wet rattle on every exhale. The sound was steady, rhythmic, and terrible, the sound of lungs working against something that was slowly filling them. Maren did not move for a full minute. Her core sampler hung from her right hand. Her spectrometer was clipped to her belt. She stood in the entrance of a pre-colonial roost tower on a dead shelf and looked at a dying dragon and felt the particular stillness that comes when the world presents you with something you cannot walk away from. Then the dragon's eyes opened. Clouded, tin-colored, with cataracts hazing the inner membrane so thick that the pupil was barely visible. The eyes moved slowly, the muscular effort visible in the tension along the jaw, until they found Marin in the entrance. They held her. The expression was one she had seen before in different faces, on old station dogs whose joints had failed, on the elderly Varandhi who waited in the processing dispensary lines with patient, eroded dignity. Not fear, not aggression, not even curiosity exactly. Exhaustion with a residue of something that would not let go. Dignity that had outlasted everything except the body it lived in. Its mouth opened. A sound came out low, resonant, vibrating in the stone floor beneath Marin's boots and in her ribcage and in the handle of her core sampler. Not a roar, not a threat display. Something closer to a word spoken through lungs that were drowning. A single sustained note that carried more information than Marin could parse: identity, location, condition, presence, compressed into a frequency that the ruins amplified and the wind carried away. Marin set down her core sampler. She sat on the rubble 3 meters from the dragon's head, cross-legged, moving slowly. She unclipped her canteen, unscrewed the cap, poured water into it until it was full, maybe 200 milliliters, and held it out at arm's length. A gesture so absurd in scale, a thimble offered to a river that later she would not be able to explain why she did it. But something about the dry, cracked texture of the scales around the dragon's mouth, and the wet rattle that meant fluid in places fluid should not be, and the clouded eyes that watched her with the patience of a creature that had been waiting for something for a very long time, something about all of it made the small gesture feel like the only correct response. The dragon's clouded eyes tracked the cap. Its nostrils flared once, twice, reading the water, reading the human, reading the intention. Then it lowered its head the last few centimeters to the stone and closed its eyes again, not refusing, deciding. Marin set the cap on the ground between them and stayed until the light shifted. She came back the next morning, and the cap was dry. By the end of the first week, Marin had established a routine that she did not question, because questioning it would have required acknowledging how much it mattered to her. Mornings at the roost tower. Afternoons running her survey transects across the shelf. Evenings writing up geological data on the field terminal during the satellite window, filing the bare minimum of survey reports that her reassignment required. The dragon, she had not named it. Naming felt presumptuous when you did not know someone's language and they had not offered, was dying. She could see that with clinical clarity. The wet rattle in its breathing was growing neither better nor worse, which meant the underlying condition was chronic and progressive. She found it in Chapter 14 of Tethrin's text, calciumite crystallization in the pleural membranes, a condition that affected very old dragons whose lung tissue could no longer shed the mineral deposits that accumulated naturally from a lifetime of calcium-rich respiration. The text called it stone lung, terminal, slow. The lungs gradually filled with calciumite crystal formations that reduced respiratory capacity over years, sometimes decades. The dragon literally drowned in stone. Treatment existed: calcium-light solvent therapy, administered in Varandhi medical compounds by trained respiratory attendants. Expensive. Specialized. Available in lowland Varandhi cities, not on dead highland shelves 2,000 meters above the nearest settlement. Marin left the canteen cap filled each morning. By day 6, she started arriving early enough to watch. The dragon did not drink while she was present, but each morning the cap was dry, and on day 7 she found a faint wet mark on the stone where the dragon's tongue, broad, dark gray, surprisingly delicate at the tip, had overshoot the cap. On day 8 it drank while she sat there. The motion was slow and careful, the great head lowering, the tongue extending to lap the water in 3 measured strokes that emptied the cap. It watched her the entire time, clouded eyes holding hers over the rim of the cap, gauging something. Trust. Intent. Whether this small creature with its thimble offering was real or a hallucination produced by a body in decline. Marin filled the cap again. It drank again. On day 9, Marin noticed something she should have noticed sooner but had dismissed as background geology. The basalt dust that accumulated on the tower floor, carried in by wind, shed from the crumbling walls, ground from the stone by the dragon's slow movements, had a particular mineral composition. She had been walking on it for 5 days. She had breathed it. It had settled in her hair and the creases of her hands and the threading of her bootlaces. She scooped a sample into a collection vial and ran it through her spectrometer out of habit, the way she ran everything through the spectrometer because that was who she was, a woman who measured things. The reading made her sit back on her heels. The basalt dust was high in calcium-magnesium silicate, with trace iron oxides and a sulfur component consistent with the volcanic origin of the shelf. Standard, unremarkable. But when she modeled the hydration behavior, what would happen to this particular mineral blend when dissolved in water and heated to biological temperature, the simulation returned a compound structurally analogous to calcium light solvent, the same compound used in Varandhi respiratory medicine, the same compound that cost more per liter than Marin earned in a month, the same compound that could dissolve the calciumite crystals that were drowning this dragon's lungs. Not identical. The natural compound would be cruder, less pure, with trace elements that the manufactured version filtered out. But the active chemistry, the calcium-magnesium silicate bonding with calciumite crystals and converting them to a soluble calcium compound that could be exhaled as vapor, that was here, in the rock beneath her boots. She stared at the spectrometer readout for a long time. Then she looked at the tower. Then she picked up a piece of basalt and turned it over in her hands. On day 10, Marin ground basalt into fine powder using the cracked spectrometer housing as a mortar and a smooth river stone as a pestle. The work was slow and physical. The basalt was hard, and she had to reduce it to a talc-fine consistency for the calcium-magnesium silicate to dissolve properly. It took 2 hours to produce enough powder for 1 dose. She dissolved the powder in warm water from her canteen, heated to just below boiling by the canteen's element, and stirred until the mineral slurry was smooth and faintly gray. She poured it into the canteen cap and set it on the floor of the tower. The dragon smelled it first. Its nostrils flared wide, wider than Marin had seen them open, and the entire head lifted, not far, maybe 15 centimeters off the stone, but the motion was deliberate, driven by intention rather than reflex, and the clouded eyes found Marin with an expression that had sharpened despite the cataracts, recognition of something specific, not just water, not just a human, something that registered in a part of the dragon's brain that was older than language. Then it drank, long measured strokes. It drained the cap and its tongue swept the interior twice, and then its head stayed raised, nostrils working, reading the aftertaste, reading what the compound was doing as it reached the warm, crystal-choked tissue of its lungs. The rattle in its breathing did not change that day, or the next. Marin had expected that the crystals had been accumulating for years, possibly decades. They would not dissolve overnight, but she mixed the slurry each morning, refining her technique, finer grind, longer soak time, warmer water. She selected basalt with darker inclusions, volcanic glass fragments that her spectrometer confirmed had higher silicate concentrations. She kept notes. On day 12, Marin noticed the change. The dragon's exhale carried a faint mineral vapor that had not been there before, visible in the cool morning air as a thin haze that rose from the nostrils and dissipated within a meter. She held a sample vial in the vapor stream and analyzed the condensate. Dissolved calciumite. The crystals in the dragon's pleural membranes were breaking down, converting to a soluble form, and being expelled with every breath. The treatment was working. She increased the concentration. By day 14, the rattle had shifted in pitch, still present, but thinner, less wet. The fluid component was reducing. The dragon's breathing, while still labored, had a depth to it that it had lacked before, as though the lungs were remembering that they had once held more air than this. On day 15, the dragon raised its head fully for the first time since Marin had found it and looked at her with both eyes open. The cataracts had not cleared, calcium magnesium silicate did not treat cataracts, but the expression behind them had transformed. The exhaustion was still there. The dignity was still there, but something else had arrived. Attention. Focused, specific, directed at Marin with an intensity that made her understand, viscerally, that this was not an animal she was treating. This was a person. Old, dying, trapped in a body that was failing them, watching her with the full cognitive weight of a mind that had been thinking for 2 centuries. It made a sound. The same low resonance as that first day, but sustained longer with a modulation in the middle that Marin's biology text identified as a Varandhi address form, a vocal structure used to acknowledge another sentient being. Not a name, a recognition. I see you. You are here. I know what you are doing. I'm here, Marin said. Ridiculous, talking to a 12-meter dragon in a ruined tower on a dead shelf 2,000 meters above the nearest settlement. But the words felt right in the way that true things do. I'll keep being here. She still had not named the dragon. But that evening, while cross-referencing the Roos Towers clan glyphs against the appendix in Tethran's text, she found a partial match that accelerated her heartbeat. The glyphs on the foundation stones belonged to the Athervan Highland line, an ancient Varandhi bloodline that had held this shelf as a territorial retreat, an elder refuge, for over 6 centuries. The line had deep roots in the Varandhi power structure. 3 members of the current Council of Stewards traced their lineage to Athervan Highland elders. Tethran's text listed the line's last known Highland elder as Rithvan, a silver male of advanced age who had withdrawn from lowland council affairs approximately 40 years earlier. The entry was brief and bore the academic tone of a footnote about someone presumed dead. No confirmed sighting since withdrawal. Highland territory classified as abandoned by compact survey, date unrecorded. 40 years. Alone on a dead shelf with stone lungs slowly filling his chest. 40 years while the compact classified his home as inert and sent disgraced researchers there to count rocks as punishment. Marin closed the book and stared at the wall of her hut for a long time. The wind outside pushed against the pressurized walls with the patient, constant pressure of something that would still be here long after she was gone. Rithvan. She said the name once, quietly in the hut. Then she went to bed and slept poorly and was at the tower before dawn. The parallel thread began without Marin knowing it. When she had filed her sediment report 3 weeks before her exile, the copies she sent to the Varandhi territorial liaison had not vanished into bureaucratic silence the way Davin Harsk had assumed they would. A Varandhi administrator named Tessith Jr., meticulous, the kind of functionary who actually read attachments instead of filing them, had logged Marin's data, cross-referenced it against the nesting ground health survey that the Varandhi Council of Stewards maintained as an internal monitoring tool, and flagged the correlation for the Council's Environmental Committee. The correlation was damning. Marin's calciumite trend lines, when overlaid on the Council's nesting success rates for the same downstream grounds, showed a direct inverse relationship. As the substrate hardened, hatchling emergence rates dropped. 3 seasons of decline. The Varandhi geochemists had been tracking the nesting decline through their own frameworks, but the data had been attributed to natural cyclical variation, the kind of explanation that holds up until someone provides an external measurement that points at the actual cause. Marin's report, with its human geological methodology and its human institutional routing, gave the numbers a second origin point that could not be dismissed as internal Varandhi politics. A human researcher, working within the Compact's own survey system, using the Compact's own equipment and protocols, had independently confirmed what the Varandhi geochemists had suspected for 2 years. The Council of Stewards convened an emergency environmental session. The data was reviewed. Tessith presented the cross-referenced analysis. A senior geochemist named Verathan confirmed the chemistry. The vote was swift. Provisional suspension of 3 processing discharge permits in the Ganeth Valley watershed, pending a full independent assessment. Davin Harsk's office received the suspension notification on day 11 of Marin's exile and immediately began drafting an appeal. The appeal argued methodological insufficiency, questioned the chain of data custody, and requested a stay of the suspension pending compact internal review. The Council's response was 2 sentences. The data had been independently verified. The suspension stood. None of this reached Marin. Her satellite window was too narrow, her uplink too slow, and her security clearance freshly reduced as part of the reassignment too limited to access compact administrative traffic. She ground basalt and tended a dying dragon, and did not know that the data she had refused to falsify was already reshaping the regulatory landscape of the Ganeth Valley. Days 16 through 22 blurred into a rhythm that Marin would later recognize as the most focused period of her professional life. Mornings, wake before dawn, hike to the meltwater channels to collect fresh water, select basalt from the lower strata where the silicate content was highest, grind it to powder, prepare the slurry, carry it to the tower. Rithvan's breathing improved steadily. The wet rattle diminished to a dry whisper by day 17, then to near silence by day 20. The exhaled mineral vapor grew denser, which meant more crystal was dissolving, which meant the treatment was accelerating as the surface area of exposed crystal increased with each layer removed. On day 18, Rithvan shifted his position for the first time. The process took 20 minutes, a slow, grinding rearrangement of his massive body that left deep scratch marks in the tower's stone floor and sent dust cascading from the walls. He moved his ruined right wing, testing the range of motion with the careful deliberation of someone inventorying what they had left. Limited. The calcified scar tissue had locked the joints decades ago. But the wing moved, and Rithvan held it extended for 30 seconds before folding it back with a sound like old leather creaking over frozen hinges. By day 19, Marin had refined her process into something approaching clinical methodology. She selected basalt with the highest silicate content, darker stone from the lower strata, where volcanic glass inclusions increased the calcium-magnesium yield by roughly 40% over surface basalt. She ground it in 2 passes. The first, a rough crush that broke the stone into gravel-sized fragments. The second, a fine grind using circular pressure that reduced the fragments to a powder fine enough to dissolve completely in warm water. She experimented with soak temperatures, finding that water at 92 degrees produced a clearer suspension with less particulate than hotter or cooler preparations. The result was a smoother slurry that Rithvan consumed more readily, and that produced a denser mineral vapor on his exhale. She documented everything, not the geology, the treatment, dosages measured by weight of basalt per volume of water, soak times, temperatures, respiratory changes logged against a timeline, exhaled vapor density estimated by visual opacity, crystal deposits collected from the tower floor each morning where the vapor had condensed overnight and dried to a fine white powder. On day 20, she noticed Rithvan's tail. It had been curled tight against his flank since she first found him, a defensive posture, Tethrin noted in Chapter 9, common in dragons experiencing respiratory distress, as though the body was trying to compress itself into a smaller target for the pain. Now the tail lay extended behind Rithvan, relaxed, stretched across the tower floor in a curve that followed the wall. The tip, armored with interlocking silver-gray scales the size of playing cards, rested near the tower entrance. When Marin stepped over it entering the chamber on the morning of day 21, the tail shifted, not a flinch, not a withdrawal, a repositioning. The kind of shift a person makes when someone they trust enters the room, making space. That evening, she sat inside the tower later than usual, writing field notes by the light of her terminal screen, while Rithvan breathed his quiet, clearing breaths in the dimness beside her. She was cross-referencing her treatment notes against Tethrin's chapter on Varandhi respiratory physiology when she heard the tail move. She looked up. Rithvan's tail had curved in a slow, deliberate arc that ended behind where Marin sat, not touching her, just present, close enough that she could feel the faint, radiant warmth of the scales. The gesture was unfamiliar, and she searched Tethrin for 20 minutes before finding it in a section on elder social behavior. Shelter arc, an elder's nonverbal signal indicating protective inclusion. Used between dragons of different ages within a familial or custodial bond. Tethrin translated the approximate meaning as, "This one is under my watch. This one is acknowledged." Marin closed the book. She looked at the tail curving behind her. She looked at Rithvan, whose clouded eyes were watching her with the steady patience of a creature who had spent 40 years with no one to shelter. "Thank you," she said. Insufficient words for what the gesture meant. But Rithvan's breathing deepened and the shelter arc held, and that was enough. On day 22, Marin realized she needed to document the treatment in a format that could survive beyond her field notes. If something happened to her illness, injury, another reassignment, no one would know what was working or why. She started a second set of records, a treatment protocol written in the dry, reproducible language of a clinical report, complete with mineral compositions, preparation methods, dosage schedules, and observed outcomes. She stored it on her field terminal alongside her survey data. She filed none of it through the satellite uplink. Her reduced clearance would not support medical or biological attachments, and she was not sure who would care, or who would understand, or who might use the information in ways she could not predict. The data existed. It would be there when it was needed. Day 26 brought Davin Harsk. Marin was walking her afternoon transect, core sampler over one shoulder, when a compact ground vehicle crested the shelf's southern access trail, a route so rough that the vehicle's suspension protested audibly across the last 200 meters. It parked beside her hut, and a man in a regional compliance uniform stepped out, adjusting his collar tabs against the wind. He was shorter than his voice had suggested on the comm call. Neat. Precise. The kind of administrator who kept his collar tabs aligned and his boots polished even on a field visit to a volcanic plateau at 2,000 meters. He had a data pad under one arm and the expression of someone performing an unpleasant task with professional thoroughness. "Dr. Solvik," he said, not Marin, the formality was a choice. "I'm conducting a routine check on reassigned personnel." There's nothing routine about a compliance officer driving 6 hours to a survey post that doesn't produce anything you monitor, Marin said. She set down the core sampler and faced him. The wind pulled at both of them impartially. Harsk's expression did not change. He was good at that. The Varandhi Council of Stewards has suspended 3 processing discharge permits based on data they attribute to your quarterly sediment report. Your original report, the one I instructed you to refile with adjusted parameters. I didn't refile it because the data was accurate. The data is under review. In the meantime, 3 processing facilities are idle, 62 compact employees are on administrative hold, and the Varandhi are using your name in formal council communications as though you're some kind of. He stopped, searching for the word that would convey the full weight of his disapproval. Advocate. I filed a sediment report, Marin said. That's my job. That was my job before you reassigned me to count rocks on a shelf you classified as inert. Harsk looked past her at the Roost Tower, 300 meters north. What is that structure? Collapsed Varandhi architecture, pre-colonial, consistent with the survey classification of this shelf as historically insignificant. The lie was smooth because it was technically true. The tower was collapsed. It was pre-colonial. The survey classification did call it insignificant. The fact that a 200-year-old dragon was breathing inside it was not a detail that Marin owed to the man who had exiled her for telling the truth about river sediment. Have you reported it? There's nothing to report beyond its geological composition, which is in my survey data. Harsk studied her, then he looked at his data pad. Your survey submissions have been minimal, boilerplate geological notation, no anomalous findings. There are no anomalous findings. You sent me to an inert shelf. The shelf is inert. The basalt is basalt. I measure it, I report it, I measure it again. Harsk nodded as though confirming something. Then he looked up from the data pad with an expression that was almost, but not quite, collegial. You could come back, you know. The situation is manageable. Refile the report with the adjusted parameters. Standard margin of error accommodation. No one's asking you to fabricate data just to acknowledge the uncertainty inherent in field measurements and present a reading that falls within an acceptable band. You could be back at Ganeth by next week. Different role. Better housing. The reassignment would be vacated. Marin looked at him. The wind moved across the shelf, carrying basalt dust and the faint sulfur smell of warm stone. Behind Harsk, 300 meters north, a roost tower held a dragon whose lungs were clearing because Marin ground the right rock into the right powder at the right temperature and brought it to him every morning. I'll stay, she said. Harsk blinked. The blink was the only moment of genuine surprise she saw from him. Then he recovered, nodded once with the crisp finality of a man closing a file, made a note on the data pad and got back in his vehicle. He was off the shelf in 20 minutes. The dust from his departure settled within an hour. The shelf returned to its wind and its silence and its basalt, and Marin walked to the tower and sat down across from Rithvan and said nothing. The old dragon watched her with his clouded eyes and breathed his quiet, clearing breaths. His tail traced the shelter arc behind her without being asked. Day 28, Rithvan stood. Not smoothly, the process took most of the morning, with long pauses between each stage as muscles unused for what might have been years relearned their work. First the forelegs braced, claws extending from their sheaths to grip the stone with a sound like iron stakes being driven into rock. Then the hindquarters lifted, trembling with the effort, the muscles along his flanks rippling under the pewter scales. Then the body rose, massive and deliberate, vertebra by vertebra, until the old dragon stood in the center of the tower chamber on 4 legs with his ruined wings half folded, and his head raised to a height that put his jaw above the remaining wall line, and his clouded eyes level with the mountain peaks to the southeast. Marin stood outside the tower and watched. She had arrived with the morning slurry and found Rithvan already in motion, 4 legs braced, head lifting. She had set the canteen on the boulder and stepped back and let him work. Rithvan's head turned slowly, scanning the horizon in an arc that covered the entire southeastern quadrant. Then it stopped, locked on a bearing that pointed toward the lowlands, toward the Ganeth Valley, toward the river systems, toward the nesting grounds. He held that orientation for almost a minute, the muscles in his jaw working, his nostrils flaring in a rhythmic pattern that looked like preparation. Then he produced a sound Marin had not heard before. Not the low address form, not the resonant word sound he used when acknowledging her presence. A call. Long, rising, starting as a subsonic vibration that Marin felt in her chest before she heard it, climbing through the audible register into a sustained note that bounced off the basalt columns of the shelf and carried into the open air, and folded into the wind and went southeast. Nothing answered. The shelf was silent. The wind carried the call away and brought back nothing but the smell of stone and scrub. But Rithvan held his posture for another hour, standing, facing southeast, waiting, When he finally lowered himself carefully back to the stone floor, a process as slow and deliberate as the rising the set of his enormous head was different. Not resigned, not defeated, expectant. The posture of someone who had sent a message and trusted the channel. He called again the next day, and the next, and the next. Marin started a second round of documentation, because she was a woman who measured things, and this was a thing worth measuring. She recorded the calls on her field terminal's microphone. Spectral analysis showed the calls operated across 3 frequency bands, simultaneously audible, subsonic, and a narrow ultrasonic register that her equipment barely detected. The pattern was consistent but not identical day to day. Each call contained a core structure that repeated, plus modulations that changed, as though Rithvan was adding information to each transmission, updating a report, amending a message. She understood with growing certainty what she was watching. Rithvan was not just recovering, he was summoning. The calls were directed at something specific, a frequency, a pattern, a territorial signal that had meaning within the Varandhi long-range communication system that Tethran's text only partially described. The range, Tethran estimated in a footnote, was potentially hundreds of kilometers for an elder's full-voice call amplified by stone terrain. Rithvan was telling the lowlands that he was alive. On day 33, Marin received an unexpected message during her satellite window. It was routed through the compact's general communication system, but the originator code was Varandhi administrative. The message was brief and precisely formatted. Dr. Marin Solvik, your sediment analysis data has been instrumental in the Council of Stewards' environmental review proceedings. The Council formally requests your permission to cite your findings in the official proceeding record. Please confirm receipt and authorization. Administrator Tessith, Varandhi Territorial Liaison Office, Ganeth Valley District. Marin confirmed. She kept the message simple, 1 sentence, authorization granted, her name and post number. Then she sat on the steps of her hut in the afternoon light and watched the cloud line and thought about the distance between filing a report that said the truth and having someone on the other side of a bureaucracy actually listen to it. 3 weeks and a punitive exile and a dying dragon, and the distance was one junior administrator named Tessith who read attachments. Day 36, an adolescent dragon arrived. Marin heard it before she saw it, a rushing displacement of air that was different from the highland wind, layered with a rhythmic percussion of wings banking hard against an updraft that the shelf's thermal columns generated in the afternoon heat. She was walking toward the roost tower with the morning slurry when a shape dropped out of the cloud layer and landed on the basalt 60 meters south of the tower with an impact that she felt through her boots. Smaller than Rithvan, maybe 5 meters nose to tail, compact, muscled with the density of a body still growing into its frame. Dark iron-gray scales with a blue-black sheen where the daylight hit them. Young. The wings folded with the crisp snap of membranes in excellent repair. The claws gripped the basalt with confident precision. The young dragon's head swiveled until it found Marin. Its eyes clear amber, no cataracts, bright with intelligence and caution, locked on her with an intensity that made her grip tighten on the canteen. Every line of its body was alert, assessing, ready to escalate or retreat based on what this human did next. Then it looked past her toward the tower. Its posture changed. The aggressive readiness dropped out of its body like water running downhill. Its head lowered and it produced a sound similar to Rithvan's address form but faster, higher, inflected with the unmistakable urgency of youth. A question. Where? How? Is it true? From inside the tower, Rithvan answered. The same call he had been sending southeast for weeks, but different now, shorter, warmer, modulated with a familial recognition that Marin could not translate but could feel. I'm here. Come in. The young dragon walked to the tower entrance, its movements suddenly careful, almost reverent. At the threshold it paused and looked back at Marin once. The amber eyes held hers for 3 seconds, not threatening, not grateful, reading. Then it ducked through the entrance and was gone. Marin heard the sounds they made together inside the tower, low, resonant, overlapping. A conversation conducted in frequencies that vibrated in her sternum and in the stone beneath her feet. She could not understand the words, but she could hear the shape of the exchange: recognition, grief, relief, update. A report delivered, a report received. She set the slurry canteen on the flat boulder outside the tower and sat down to wait. The young dragon emerged an hour later. It walked directly to Marin's boulder. Its head lowered until its amber eyes were level with hers, close enough that she could see her reflection in the iris, see the fine scaling along its jaw where the iron gray gave way to a softer graphite at the throat, see the individual plates of armor along its brow ridge where the scales interlocked with the precision of machined components. It exhaled, warm, sulfuric, deliberate, a controlled breath directed at Marin's face and hands, reading her scent, reading the basalt dust in her skin, reading the mineral residue on the canteen she held. Its mouth opened and a sound came out that was not the address form and was not the question form. It was something else entirely, a structured vocalization that Tethran's text, when Marin consulted it that evening, identified as the guardian acknowledgement. The form used by Varandhi Young to formally confirm the identity and role of an elder's chosen keeper. You are the one attending our elder. We see you. We confirm you. Iron, that was the name Marin would learn later, when she understood enough of the Varandhi naming conventions to parse it from the introductory call the young dragon had made to Rithvan. A great-grandchild of the Athervan Highland line, from the lowland branch that had maintained continuous council representation, while the highland territory stood empty for 4 decades. Iron had not come alone. Iron had come first to scout, to verify, to confirm that the human at the Roost Tower was what Rithvan's calls had described. Days 37 through 41, Iron stayed. The adolescent dragon slept outside the tower in a shallow depression it scraped in the basalt, a neat oval, body length, with raised edges where the displaced rock formed a crude windbreak. Wings folded over its back like a tent. It watched Marin with unwavering attention, every slurry preparation, every visit to Rithvan, every sediment transect she walked across the shelf's terrain. It did not interfere. It did not approach the tower when Marin was inside with Rithvan, but it was always present, always watching, and its amber eyes tracked her movements with an intelligence that made Marin feel simultaneously observed, and she searched for the right word for 3 days before finding it: accompanied. Not guarded, not surveilled, accompanied, as though Iron understood that Marin's work was solitary and had decided without being asked that it would be solitary with company from now on. Rithvan's improvement accelerated. By day 38, the wet rattle was entirely gone. His breathing was deep, slow, and clear, the breath of an enormous creature whose lungs were working again. He stood daily now without trembling, and his head remained at full height for hours, and the calls he sent southeast were stronger, more complex, layered with harmonic structures that Marin's field equipment could not fully resolve. On day 39, Marin's satellite window delivered an unusual volume of traffic. 3 messages from Administrator Tessith, forwarded as a batch with a cover note that said only, "For your information, Dr. Solvik." The messages were summaries of council proceedings, dry bureaucratic language wrapped around an extraordinary development. The Council of Stewards had voted, by a margin of 11-2, to commission an independent environmental survey of all compact processing discharge sites within Varandhi nesting territory. The scope was unprecedented. Marin's original sediment report was cited 17 times in the preceding record as the catalyzing data. Her methodology, a human geological survey framework applied to Varandhi biological indicators, was described in the Council's formal language as a bridge between measurement paradigms that has been absent from territorial environmental oversight for the duration of the compact's administrative tenure. The fourth message in the batch was from Davin Harsk's office. Brief. Administrative. Marin's reassignment to the Athervon Shelf was under review, no further details provided. She saved all of it and said nothing to anyone. She ground basalt and prepared the morning slurry and brought it to Rithvan, and when the old dragon drank, she sat with him in the silence of the tower and felt the weight of 39 days settle into something that was not exhaustion and was not triumph. It was closer to what she had felt the first morning she filed the sediment report accurately. The specific, unremarkable steadiness of doing the next right thing and letting the next right thing do its work. Day 42, a second dragon arrived. Mottled green bronze, medium-sized, scarred across the left flank from an old territorial dispute. Then a third, smaller, rust-red, with the careful movements of a creature navigating unfamiliar ground. By the evening of day 43, 5 dragons perched on the shelf's basalt columns and terraces, ranging from adolescent iron size to a scarred jade-green adult twice as large. All from the Athervon line. All drawn by Rithvan's calls. All performing the same ritual on arrival. Entering the tower, conversing with Rithvan in those low, overlapping frequencies, then emerging and approaching Marin's boulder to deliver the guardian acknowledgement exhale. Iron had positioned itself between the newcomers and Marin's hut, not threatening, not blocking, directing, managing introductions, establishing spatial protocol. When the jade-green adult landed too close to the hut, Iron produced a short, sharp vocalization and the adult adjusted its approach. The amber eyes checked Marin's face afterward, gauging her reaction. "It's fine," Marin told Iron. Another ridiculous conversation with a dragon, another one that felt right. Day 44. Marin brought the morning slurry and found the tower entrance blocked by a dragon she had not seen arrive. Massive, obsidian-black scales with an iridescent green-purple sheen that shifted as the creature breathed, like oil on dark water. Easily Rithvan's size, maybe larger, with intact wings folded along a body that radiated health and power, and an authority so tangible that Marin felt it as a physical compression of the air around her. The eyes were clear gold, Rithvan's clouded tin, purified and sharpened across generations. The head was angled toward Marin with an expression that contained multitudes. Assessment, recognition, something that might have been gratitude if gratitude could be expressed with the weight of a mountain behind it. This was Kelthari, Rithvan's direct descendant, matriarch of the lowland Athervon branch, and sitting member of the Varandhi Council of Stewards. She had come with a column of 15. The dragons that had been arriving over the past 2 days were her advance scouts. The column stretched back along the southern approach trail, a procession of scales catching the morning light in colors that ran from deep bronze to forest green to the dark crimson of old garnets. Kelthari looked at Marin, at the canteen in her hands, at the basalt dust ground into the creases of her fingers and the seams of her field jacket, at the spectrometer mortar tucked under her arm, cracked and stained with mineral residue from 44 days of use, at the spine of Tethrin's text visible in her jacket pocket. Marin looked back. She did not kneel. She did not bow. She did not do anything except stand in the highland wind with the morning slurry and wait, because she was a woman who measured things, and you could not measure a moment like this by trying to perform it. The great dragon lowered her head, not the address form, not the guardian acknowledgement that the younger dragons had given. A formal inclination, slow, deliberate, controlled, her obsidian jaw descending until it rested on the basalt a meter from Marin's boots. The Varandhi honor greeting. Tethrin described it in Chapter 11 as the form reserved for council members, territorial elders, and individuals who had performed acts of sustained service to the Varandhi community. In 6 centuries of recorded usage, it had been directed at a non-Varandhi species fewer than a dozen times. Behind Kelthari, in the column stretching back along the southern approach trail, 15 dragons of the Athervon line lowered their heads in unison. The sound it made, the collective displacement of air as 15 massive skulls descended, was like a single deep breath drawn by the shelf itself. From inside the tower, Rithvan's voice rose. Clear, steady, strong, the strongest sound Marin had heard from him in 44 days. Not a call, not an address form. A declaration, a formal vocalization that carried across the shelf and silenced the wind and resonated in every column of basalt and in every dragon's chest and in the stone under Marin's boots. A naming. The word he spoke was not directly translatable. Varanthi naming conventions operated across frequency bands that human vocal cords could not reproduce and human ears could only partially detect. But Tethran's text had a section on elder naming ceremonies, and the closest human approximation of the concept was keeper of the ground, the one who tends what is beneath, the one who reads the stone and finds what it holds and gives it where it is needed. Not a ruler, not a savior. A tender, someone who does the work of sustaining because the work is there and they are able. Kelthari lifted her head and looked at Marin with those clear golden eyes, and Marin saw in them the same thing she had seen in Rithvan's clouded gaze on day 4. Recognition. Not of a title or a status or a political position. Recognition of a quality. The specific, unremarkable quality of someone who sees what needs doing and does it, and does not stop doing it, and does not ask to be recognized for doing it. The quality that Davin Harsk had tried to exile, and that the basalt had amplified, and that Rithvan had seen through cataracts, and that a column of dragons had followed across 200 kilometers of terrain to confirm. The council has matters to discuss with you, Dr. Solvik, a voice said behind Kelthari. Tessith. The administrator had arrived with the delegation, traveling in a ground vehicle that had followed the column's approach route. Data pad in hand, collar tabs slightly crooked from the journey, as precise in person as in writing. Regarding the Environmental Survey Commission, and regarding the status of this territorial shelf, and regarding a covenant provision that we believe applies to your situation. Show them what you've been making first, Tessith added, quieter, not an instruction, a suggestion from someone who had read enough council records to know how these things worked. They need to see it. Marin set the canteen on the boulder. She picked up the spectrometer mortar, and she showed them. She showed them the basalt, the lower strata, the volcanic glass inclusions, the calcium-magnesium silicate content. She showed them the grind 2 passes, rough then fine, the river stone pestle she had worn smooth over 44 days. She showed them the slurry, the dissolution temperature, the soak time, the consistency. She showed them the spectrometer readings, the treatment protocol she had documented, the respiratory improvement timeline, the exhaled vapor analysis, the calciumite deposits collected from the tower floor. She showed them Rithvan, standing, breathing, clear-lunged and steady on 4 legs in the center of a tower that had been his home for longer than any of them had been alive, looking at his descendants with eyes that were clouded but absolutely, unmistakably present. The formal proceedings took 3 days. Kelthari and a council delegation remained on the shelf, while Marin walked the geochemist Verithan through her methodology and answered questions through a translation framework that Tessith facilitated with quiet competence. The proceedings were thorough, unhurried, and conducted with a gravity that told Marin this was not just bureaucracy. This was a species reckoning with the discovery that an elder they had mourned as lost was alive, breathing, and being tended by a human who had been punished for telling the truth about their river. The council confirmed the permanent suspension of the processing discharge permits. They formalized the citation of Marin's environmental data, and they enacted a provision that Marin had not anticipated, and that changed everything. The Athervan Highland Shelf was reclassified from compact survey territory to Varanthi protected heritage ground, under a clause in the original colonial charter that permitted territorial reclamation, when a living elder of a founding line was confirmed in continuous residence. Rithvan was that elder, The shelf had been his. It had always been his. The compact had classified it as inert and used it as a dumping ground for inconvenient employees. And the whole time, a founding elder of one of the veranda's most ancient lines had been breathing stone-lung alone in his own roost tower. The keeper-advocate designation was older than the compact, older than human contact with the veranda. It came from a covenant that predated interstellar travel, a title given to any being, of any species, who sustained an elder of a founding line through an act of voluntary, sustained, and unrequested care. The title was not honorary. It carried territorial privileges. Marin could remain on the shelf indefinitely, under veranda jurisdiction rather than compact authority. Her research would be funded through the Council's environmental oversight budget. Her sediment methodology would be adopted as a supplementary assessment framework for nesting ground evaluation across all veranda territories. Davin Harsk's appeal of the permit suspensions was denied on the same day the keeper-advocate designation was formalized. His office was subsequently folded into a joint compact veranda environmental compliance directorate, staffed by personnel who were inclined to read sediment reports rather than bury them. Marin received a brief message informing her of her reinstatement to full research credentials. She did not reply. On the evening of the third day, after the delegation had departed and the shelf had settled into its wind and its quiet, Marin sat inside the roost tower with Rithvan. The old dragon was lying in his usual position, but his breathing was steady and deep and clear, and his head was raised, and his clouded eyes tracked the last light as it moved across the broken upper walls of the tower he had built 6 centuries ago. Iron was curled outside the entrance, amber eyes half closed, settled into the shallow depression that had become a permanent nest. 3 other Athervan dragons rested on the shelf's basalt terraces, returned to a territory their line had abandoned 40 years ago, reclaiming perches their ancestors had carved. Tessith had left Marin a parting gift, a veranda analysis tablet, preloaded with 40 years of territorial environmental data that had never been cross-referenced against human geological survey frameworks. Enough work for a decade, maybe 2. "There's a junior researcher at the Ganeth Valley Station," Tessith had said before boarding the delegation's transport. "Human. She has been running parallel sediment analyses on her own time because no one in the compact hierarchy asked her to, and no one in the veranda system knew she existed. Her name is Korath. With your permission, I will suggest she apply for a posting here." "Tell her to bring a good mortar," Marin had said. Now she sat in the tower with Rithvan and listened to him breathe. The old dragon's tail rested in the shelter arc behind her, the warm weight of it curving through the space like a parenthesis around a quiet statement. Not touching, just present. The wind moved over the shelf, carrying the clean mineral smell of basalt and the faint sulfuric warmth of dragon breath and the distant sound of iron shifting in his sleep. Marin picked up the spectrometer mortar and began preparing tomorrow's slurry. The basalt was good stone. It had been here for millennia, built by forces that did not care about quarterly reports or compliance officers or the distance between what was true and what was convenient. It would keep giving what it had to give for as long as someone was willing to grind it fine enough and warm it gently enough and carry it to where it was needed. She had not come here to find a dragon. She had come here because she would not change a number on a report. And the number had been right, and the stone had been here, and the dragon had been drowning in his own lungs in a tower that had been his home for longer than the compact had existed. And Marin had looked at what was in front of her and done the next thing. Not the brave thing, not the extraordinary thing, the next thing. That was all it had ever been. The next thing and the next and the next. 44 mornings of ground stone and warm water and sitting with someone who needed her to stay. Rithvan's breath stirred the dust on the tower floor. His clouded eyes found Marin in the dimming light, and his massive head lowered until it rested on the stone beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from the old silver scales and the slow, strong pulse beneath them. She put her hand on the broad plate between his eyes. The scales were warm and dry and solid under her palm. The pulse was steady, not fast, not urgent, the heartbeat of a creature who had time again. "I'm here," she said, the same words as day 4, still absurd, still the truest thing she had. Rithvan closed his eyes and breathed, and the shelter arc of his tail held steady behind her, and the roost tower stood around them both like a promise the stone had been keeping for 40 years. Outside, Iron lifted his head and watched the cloud line brighten with the last of the day's light, and the highland wind carried something it had not carried in 4 decades, the scent of tended ground and warm stone, and a creature breathing clear. Someone was here, someone steady, someone who would stay.